The whole world would like to know where Covid-19 came from. The WHO sent an investigative team to Wuhan, China to look into the matter. At the end of their short visit, they held a press conference. They said they're still pursuing all possible avenues of inquiry, except for one. They're definitely ruling out the idea that it was released from the Virology lab in Wuhan. Peter Ben and Barak, head of the mission, said this: the laboratory incident hypothesis is extremely unlikely to explain the introduction of the virus into the human population. Therefore, it is not in the hypotheses that we will suggest for future studies. Is that a fair conclusion? And if you think otherwise, you're just peddling conspiracy theories? Or is something very odd going on? Well, let's have a look. If you're sceptical of the WHO investigation group conclusion, well, you're not entirely alone. The United States isn't buying it. It said it's reserving its judgment in spite of what the WHO might say. But then that's obviously, crazy Trump conspiracy theories. No, can't use that excuse anymore. Well, let's step back and look at some of the context. In the early months of the pandemic, it was quickly noticed that Wuhan, thought to be the original site of the outbreak, happened to be home to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. SARS-CoV-2, the name of the virus that causes Covid-19, was thought to be a novel coronavirus originating in bats. And the Wuhan Institute had been doing work on bat coronaviruses, so it's not too much of a stretch to say that is a pretty remarkable coincidence. Coincidences do happen, of course. Very quickly, there were some relatively wild stories circulating, which painted graphic tales of researchers talking about having been splashed with bat blood and urine at the lab, and others that a named researcher at the lab was patient zero and was now missing. Others speculated that the disease had been created in the lab for the purposes of biological warfare or research, so it would never have existed but for human invention. There was a supposed Chinese whistleblower who produced a paper that virologists looked at and pretty quickly dismissed as junk. Separately, President Trump also stated with his characteristic but unpersuasive certainty that it had definitely been released from a lab. Most of those early stories were shown to be false, not least by Potholer54, who did a forensic takedown of some, tracing the original sources on the Chinese blogosphere and showing that they'd been misrepresented or exaggerated. But not all the responses were so evidence-led and factual. The fact that Trump had expressed an opinion on the subject was quite enough to get at least half of the population of the United States to dismiss it as a crazy conspiracy theory on principle. Because, Orange Man bad or something. A number of scientists issued a statement in support of the scientists, public health professionals and medical professionals of China combating Covid-19, which appeared in The Lancet on February 19, 2020. And it said this: the rapid, open and transparent sharing of data on this outbreak is now being threatened by rumours and misinformation around its origins. We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that Covid-19 does not have a natural origin. Scientists from multiple countries have published and analysed genomes of the causative agent, severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, SARS-CoV-2, and they overwhelmingly conclude that this coronavirus originated in wildlife. And that seemed to be backed up by the release of this paper, The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, in the journal Nature Medicine on 17th of March 2020. It said that having studied the sequenced genome, there were several features that led the researchers to conclude that they had found strong evidence that SARS-CoV-2 is not the product of purposeful manipulation. So theories that it could have been created in a lab were argued against. But that didn't necessarily rule out a lab release, however. The same paper went on to say this: basic research involving passage of bat SARS-CoV-like coronaviruses in cell culture and or animal models has been ongoing for many years in biosafety level 2 laboratories across the world. And there are documented instances of laboratory escapes of SARS-CoV. We must therefore examine the possibility of an inadvertent laboratory release of SARS-CoV-2. So the paper, very often quoted as proving it couldn't have come from a lab, didn't say quite that. It said that it wasn't an artificially created human-made virus, but it could be based on a natural coronavirus that had been worked on with certain gain-of-function techniques, or even simply just studied and accidentally released. And in some ways, it's hard to understand why you wouldn't start with that as your most likely hypothesis. The evolutionary biologist Bret used what I thought was a good analogy. He said that if you were in a city and the circus was in town and you saw a bear walking down the street, and you're not part of a country where bears are natively wild in the surrounding countryside, and yes, the circus is of the type that has live animals, you would be well advised to start with a null hypothesis, that's to say, the default assumption that the bear had come from the circus rather than from nature. Yes, the Wuhan virus lab has bat coronaviruses. No, those bats are not present near to Wuhan itself. So why wouldn't you start from the null hypothesis that a lab leak is the most likely source? I mean, it doesn't mean that you just conclude that must be the case. You have to find proof. The hypothesis could well be wrong, but isn't it basic common sense that you would look at every single detail from every angle to see if there's any possible aspect whereby it came from the lab? You would think. In a world without politics. But of course we live in a world of geopolitics and blame and retribution and all of the rest of it. China had huge incentives to insist that they could not be to blame, obviously. There would be a massive consequence to them if it turned out otherwise. And so they did. In the way of authoritarian governments, they did so aggressively, and they sought to shut down any discussion of the possibility whatsoever. For the first year, they prohibited access to the lab, they did their own investigations and were not even remotely transparent about how and what they were looking at. You might take that as de facto evidence that they had something to hide. Lots of people did. Because otherwise, why would they be like that? Well, look, it's suggestive, but I can give you a highly likely scenario where that happens even if they weren't the source. Let's take three starting assumptions based on real-life observation of authoritarian governments in general and recent Chinese government behaviour in particular. 1. There are usually very negative consequences for individuals who preside over something that goes wrong. 2. As a result, such individuals very commonly do not honestly report up the line when things do go wrong. They seek to cover it up. Lie or die? It's not that hard a question to answer for most people. 3. Government bureaucrats and officials are not scientists, so you can expect them to have similar instincts to other non-scientists. So, take scenario 1. Nothing comes out of the lab. The scientists are sure of it. They can provide evidence to support their certainty up to a point. But the government officials do exactly what so many of the Western commentators have done. They say, but it's intuitively obvious, it must have come from here, so we don't believe you, because we're used to people lying when there's trouble. And because they fear the world consequences of being seen to be the source, they cover up and make sure that nobody else can come in to find what they think they must have missed. Or an alternative scenario. Yes, there is a lab leak. The scientists realise it, but they try to cover it up from the government, fearing what will happen to them. It could even be just one scientist who knows it, and his or her colleagues don't realise what happened because that individual covered their own back. The scenario plays out exactly the same. Maybe the local authorities find out the truth with their own investigation, maybe they don't. It all looks the same from the outside. So yes, China has behaved how you would expect it to behave when it's determined not to be shown to be the cause of this global pandemic. That's evidence of their intent, and to some degree their state of mind. It's not on its own evidence of their guilt. But there's still a bear wandering down the street. So that's why China would behave that way. Why would the WHO task force be so quick to rule it out? I mean, they are, after all, scientists. And some of their members are being extremely clear. Peter Daszak, for instance, he tweeted this. On gain-of-function work at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, we had detailed discussion with people there about all aspects of lab leak hypothesis and received satisfactory answers. Minutes of our meetings will be in the full report. That doesn't seem hugely conclusive. It confirms that they talked to people, asked questions, and then completely accepted the answers. At a press conference, they were asked why they'd rejected the lab leak theory. The answer was that nowhere was this precise virus being studied anywhere in the world, plus it's very unlikely it could have escaped from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Accidents like this are very rare. And that's just bizarre. I mean, obviously accidents like this are very rare, but as we've already noted, they do happen. Only needed to happen once. Things that are very rare happen in the world all of the time. Indeed, whatever happened to create this virus is very rare, otherwise the world would be swimming in them. The head of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, Dr. Shi Zhengli, has said in an interview that when the news came through, she first asked herself whether the leak could have come from her lab. So whether likely or not, she clearly entertained it as a possibility. It's not surprising that people think that this is where the politics comes in. They point to the fact that China is a powerful force with W.H.O, has been a major funder of the organisation, having resisted any sort of investigation, indeed even punishing Australia for daring to call for one. They eventually got this visit branded as a joint WHO-China investigation. People have also been pointing at a rather remarkable and obvious conflict of interest with Peter Daszak. Daszak is the head of an organisation called EcoHealth Alliance in the United States. There he has done work on bat coronaviruses. His organisation worked directly with the Wuhan Institute of Virology on exactly that. Indeed, there's footage of him working at the Wuhan Institute. Here's one of numerous grant applications for projects from him working on bat coronaviruses in China. You have to say, that constitutes a blatant conflict of interest for a mission that should include serious scrutiny of the Institute. Indeed, it isn't unreasonable to suppose that Daszak's own work could be implicated by such an inquiry. And it's not as though only wide-eyed conspiracists made this point. The US-based AIDS Healthcare Foundation was one of many who objected. They said this: a conflict of interest of one of the current WHO-sanctioned team members and the tightly choreographed format of the field research cast doubt on the investigation's credibility and the validity of the eventual findings. Various experts in the field also pitched in. Dr. Philippa Lentsos, an expert in biological threats at King's College London, said that she couldn't imagine a lead investigator with more vested interests. Even the Scripps Research Institute biologist Christian Andersen, the author of the original paper we mentioned that counted out a lab origin for the virus, said this: "Not the right person for the job. That's ridiculous." And yes, Daszak was a strong opponent of the idea that the virus might have been leaked from a lab well before the mission took place. Indeed, remember that letter back in February 2020 angrily dismissing all those conspiracy theorists? Not only was he a signatory to that letter, a Freedom of Information request found that he had been the principal organiser of it. And he's certainly not giving an inch in the face of criticism. Here's his tweet, contemptuously dismissing the concerns of the United States of America, a message which was, unsurprisingly, eagerly reported by the Chinese People's Daily. Joe Biden has to look tough on China. Please don't rely too much on US intel. Increasingly disengaged under Trump and frankly wrong on many aspects. Daszak's work with the Wuhan Institute reportedly included gain-of-function research, according to Colin Butler, who edited a scientific journal with him for a while. So there's that phrase again. What's gain-of-function research? Manipulation of viruses to add certain capabilities to them. Let's just take another look at that area. Gain-of-function research is, unsurprisingly, controversial. Its proponents suggest that by adding to a virus's capabilities in a laboratory, you can gain information about how such a powerful virus would work, enabling you to better develop defences should it arise in nature. Its detractors say that by creating such a virus in the lab, you obviously create the possibility it will escape into the wild and become the thing you fear. In 2015, for discussion was picked up by this paper in Nature. Engineered bat virus stirs debate over risky research. An experiment that created a hybrid version of a bat coronavirus, one related to the virus that causes SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, has triggered renewed debate over whether engineering lab variants of viruses with possible pandemic potential is worth the risks. That was prompted by another paper. A SARS-like cluster of circulating bat coronaviruses shows potential for human emergence. This detailed research, where the surface protein of the coronavirus was added to the backbone of a SARS virus to create a chimera virus that, unlike most coronaviruses from bats, could infect human cells. Virologists question whether the information gleaned from the experiment justifies the potential risk. Although the extent of any risk is difficult to assess, Simon Wayne Hobson, a virologist at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, points out that the researchers have created a novel virus that grows remarkably well in human cells. If the virus escaped, nobody could predict the trajectory, he says. That brings us to some interesting arguments relating to the nature of the virus that we're dealing with. First of all, let's just map out the different routes of the virus to the point where it can infect and pass from human to human. First, it has to move from a bat to a human. Most bat coronaviruses are not capable of doing that. However, researchers at the Wuhan Institute did uncover one variant, which they labelled as RATG13, which had the ability to do this. In genetic terms, it targets the ACE2 receptor in human cells, which is what enables it to invade them. RATG13 had about a 96% match to the genome of SARS-CoV-2, which is close, but not that close. Really, it's a distant relative. But it does show that a coronavirus can move directly from a bat to a human. More often, it would end up in another animal, which was more amenable and which would provide an environment to adapt and develop capabilities to make the next step. The pangolin was thought to have been a likely contender, although that theory now seems to be discredited. Ferrets or mink are likewise very amenable. Some are now pondering the possibility of Chinese ferret badgers. So that's two routes: bat to human, bat to other animal to human. The other explanation is bat to laboratory to human. Now, when the previous SARS-CoV virus led to the 2003 SARS outbreak, the thing that was notable was that once it had made the leap to a human host via palm civets, the virus was not that well suited to its new environment. It had to mutate and evolve pretty rapidly to better invade human cells and then develop the ability to jump from human to human. And its limited skills in that regard was one reason why that outbreak didn't become a global pandemic. However, and this is one of the most telling aspects, when SARS-CoV-2 first emerged, it seemed already to be well adapted to humans. It already had the ability to efficiently invade human cells and spread from human to human. And it stayed remarkably stable in those early months, as though it was already so well adapted and mature for its environment. Now, that is highly unlikely, vanishingly unlikely, to be how it arrived from a bat. So either it did a lot of evolution within a very compatible animal before leaping to humans, or it was spreading unnoticed in humans in a less powerful form for a significant period of time before emerging in the current form, which you'd then expect to be able to find evidence of that. Or it went through its evolutionary process in a laboratory specifically to be suited for human spread, gain-of-function research. The Wuhan Institute has been somewhat cagey about its work in this area from the start. Let's go back to that distant cousin coronavirus, RATG13. It was discovered by Dr. Shi Zhengli, head of the Wuhan Institute, in 2012 after 6 men clearing bat droppings from a cave in Moyang County in Yunnan province fell ill with severe pneumonia infection. 3 of them died from it. Over the next few years, Dr. Shi sent numerous expeditions to that cave to collect samples, which brought back to Wuhan at least 9 different SARS-like coronaviruses. After news of SARS-CoV-2 broke, Dr. Shi says that she found that part of a sequence of a novel coronavirus closely resembled a short sequence from one of the bat viruses collected from that cave, which she'd labelled as RATG13. she published this finding in Nature in February 2020, but she made no reference to Moyang, no mention of the men and the disease that they'd caught, implying that the unknown RATG13 virus had been sequenced in the most recent analysis. The article I mentioned earlier, The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2 by Christian Andersen et al., the one that first said it couldn't have been man-made, it drew from Dr. Shi's original article. But some independent researchers began to raise doubts. Monali C. Rahalka and Rahul A. Balhulika published an article claiming that the RATG13 virus is identical to another virus sample named BT-CoV4991, which was uploaded by the Wuhan researchers in 2016. They criticised Dr. Shi for not making it clear that the one came from the other and for not mentioning the history of the miners who died. Dr. Shi eventually added an addendum to the Nature article, adding that extra information and clarifying that the virus was sequenced in 2018. In an interview with Scientific American in June last year, Dr. Shi had claimed that the 6 men in 2012 had been sickened by fungal spores, not by coronavirus. Well, that didn't seem to be supported by the master's thesis written by one of the doctors who treated the miners, who described a disease that seems similar to Covid-19 in many aspects, and concluded that the prospect of fungal infection was actually slim. One of the researchers that's been on this case is Alina Chan, a postdoctoral fellow at the Broad Institute at MIT and Harvard. An article on the Minerva website quoted as saying this: "Many readers of the Nature article, including myself, interpreted the relevant text to mean that the RATG13 full-length genome sequencing was only performed after the RDRP match between SARS-CoV-2 and RATG13. From interviews of Peter Daszak, a close collaborator of Shi Zhengli, I also had the impression that the RATG13 sample had not been full genome sequenced until after the Covid-19 outbreak. However, in the Science Q&A, Shi informed us that RATG13's full genome had been sequenced in 2018, and that this process had depleted the sample entirely. Chan said that the methods section of the Nature article looks strange if the Institute had already completed sequencing of RATG13 in 2018. Not only that, what database was the RATG13 sequence uploaded to in 2018, since it wasn't public? And are there any other unpublished virus genomes stored in that database? Well, maybe Peter Daszak would know, given that he was such a close collaborator on the project. But don't worry. Definitely no conflict of interest stuff going on there. Again, none of this is conclusive that these unusual behaviours are necessarily covering up evidence that SARS-CoV-2 came from the work being done in the Wuhan lab. There are some big leaps you still have to make to come to that conclusion. However, it's not exactly incompatible with that view either. You would conclude that there is a contradiction in the published accounts that should be closely and carefully investigated, and preferably not by Peter Daszak. The idea that the question of lab manipulation has been put to rest is now starting to be challenged. In this paper, might SARS-CoV-2 have arisen via serial passage through an animal host or cell culture by Sirotkin and Sirotkin? They talk about how one of the genetic features thought to make SARS-CoV-2 more transmissible is something called a furin cleavage site. And it's something that no other coronavirus in the same lineage has. It could have arisen through mutation within a second host species, or alternatively via one of two lab processes, which the paper goes on to discuss. In an update to their paper, they note that the processes would be one explanation for why, although its original parent host was putatively bats, this novel coronavirus appears to bind very tightly to human ACE2 and is observed by in vitro analysis to bind more weakly to bats than many other mammals. In this article, David Relman says this: "Some have argued that a deliberate engineering scenario is unlikely because one would not have had the insight a priori to design the current pandemic virus." That's a reference to Andersen's paper, which we've discussed before. This argument fails to acknowledge the possibility that two or more as yet undisclosed ancestors, i.e. more proximal ancestors than RATG13 and RMYNO2, had already been discovered and were being studied in a laboratory. For example, one with the SARS-CoV-2 backbone and spike protein receptor binding domain, and the other with the SARS-CoV-2 polybasic furin cleavage site. It would have been a logical next step to wonder about the properties of a recombinant virus and then create it in the laboratory. So the two powerful features that make SARS-CoV-2 so virulent, the spike protein targeting the ACE2 receptor and the furin cleavage site, is suggesting that if you take two viruses, each of which has one of those two elements, and then you combine them together. Some scientists are raising skeptical questions, therefore, and it turned out just a couple of days before the shooting of this video that W.H.O wasn't quite ready to stand robustly behind that press conference either. The WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus said, "I want to clarify that all hypotheses remain open and require further study." He's not quite so quick to dismiss the President of the United States, maybe. One member of the WHO team that visited Wuhan, Dominic Dwyer, said that they hadn't seen anything to suggest a lab accident, but then he said this: "Now, whether we were shown everything, you can never know. The group wasn't designed to go and do a forensic examination of lab practice." And there's nothing wrong with that statement, unless you just made a statement ruling out a lab accident, you'd think. Once they'd returned home, the WHO team revealed that Chinese scientists had refused to share raw data with them. Disagreements over patient records and other issues were so tense that sometimes they erupted into shouts among the typically mild-mannered scientists on both sides. Apparently, Chinese officials pushed the WHO team to adopt the government's narrative that the virus might have spread to China from elsewhere. Dr. Thea Fisher, another team member, said this: "It was my take on the entire mission that it was highly geopolitical." Well, indeed. So, let's sum up where we are. We've seen that in the early stages, when Trump was making pronouncements and wild stories were floating around, the virologist community rushed to form a rapid consensus to rule out the release of the virus from the Wuhan lab. Since then, there have been voices raised and papers produced to say, hold on. Scientifically, the evidence is not yet so conclusive that you should be ruling this out. Now, none of the credible papers prove that a lab origin is certain. They just demonstrate potential pathways that shouldn't be dismissed. A point that gains in force, since in spite of a lot of looking, no third animal species has yet been discovered that acted as the intermediary. If it had been, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. The rest of it is all political. The actions of China to aggressively defend its claims of innocence, the astonishingly compromised WHO exercise which brought in some of the very people who have everything to lose if a Wuhan lab leak was to be identified. The elements pointing to lab leak are circumstantial, but then, so are the elements pointing anywhere else, except of course for the fact that bats were the original starting point. If a Wuhan lab leak was the source, we will probably never know the truth unless by the intervention of a genuine whistleblower. We'll keep looking and wondering why we never found the host animal. But I don't think it would be unreasonable to ask again whether we think gain of research lab activity should be allowed. We should have that conversation as if we did know that it was a lab leak this time. Because we don't need to attribute blame, surely, in order to learn the lesson.